Does the soul exist? And how important is the soul regarding the truth of Christianity?
Well, I submit to you that if there's no soul, then there can be no resurrection as the Bible describes it, and thus Christianity would be false.
Welcome, everybody, to the Truthful Hope Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Vasquez. Does the soul exist? While this is by no means proof of the existence of the soul, Pew Research Center reported in 2023 that 83% of U.S. adults believe they have a soul or spirit in addition to their physical body. And as philosophers Mark Baker and Stuart Goetz said, most people at most times, in most places, at most ages have believed in the soul. And yet, when mentioning the soul with skeptics today, you're bound to get scoffed at and dismissed immediately for believing in some mythical entity that carries no substance. And hopefully by the end of this episode, you'll understand the pun that I did there. But critically, this is important. If there is no soul, then what? And how important is the soul regarding the truth of Christianity? As we'll see throughout this episode, it's tremendously important for Christians to know that they are souls and be able to defend it out in the field. And for all truth seekers out there, despite whether one believes in God or not, belief in the soul is warranted by the vast amount of evidence in support of it. So to help me work through the case for the soul, I have joining me now for the second time an incredibly wise and impactful Christian apologist who, among many things, specializes in the philosophy of mind, and that is Eric Hernandez. Thank you so much for coming back on the show, Eric.
Hey, thanks for having me again.
It's a huge honor. We were talking before the recording. You're graciously accepted to endorse the book that I've been writing, and in there is a section on the soul because it's so important for personhood about our identity, and I tackle it from a perspective of abortion. But you have written in the lazy approach to evangelism, and then another book you've contributed to, Faith Examined. You had a whole chapter on this, on the soul, and your work has been tremendously helpful in my work as well. So I'm really looking forward to just sitting with you and talking out the case for the soul. Now, before we get into some of the evidence and all the good stuff and the terms that we're going to have to help our listeners learn, I do want to start on a practical level. Why is this so important for Christians? Why does it matter that a Christian knows that they are a soul and is equipped to defend it? In your book, in your chapter, Faith Examined, you talk about Professor P and the objection that you face from him regarding the soul. So if you could talk about that and maybe encourage Christians as to why they need to be familiar with the case for the soul.
Yeah, great questions. And yeah, this is I think it's very much vitally important. If you were to ask your average Christian, what is a soul? They'll probably say something like it's a thing that goes to heaven when you die. It's more like just a functional view of what it does rather than necessarily what it is. And interestingly, and I'm kind of jumping right in the deep end here, or opening up a can of worms. Then you ask people, well, do animals have souls? And I'm surprised how many Christians I hear say no, they don't. Because again, they just assume the soul is a thing that goes to heaven. They assume maybe animals don't go to heaven, therefore animals don't have souls. And we can get to that later. I'll just leave that right there. Stay tuned, if you will. Watch to the end of the video, as they say. So first and foremost, because it's what Scripture teaches. I mean, there's a lot of Scripture we can go into, but Jesus clearly taught this. Paul taught this. And more specifically, that we are souls distinct from our bodies. And if we're just going to go biblically here, even that our souls could be separated from our bodies. I know that'd be a separate question. In the case that we'll make here, I'm not necessarily going to argue for that, but it would be consistent with that. But given that we're speaking just biblically and theologically, for example, you see that Paul says things like this. He says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So what he's identifying there is first and foremost that I, the self, when I use the word I, that letter I to refer to me. That's what philosophers call indexical words, and that basically means it's a word used to refer to something. So when I say here or there, that's referring to location. When I say me or you, I'm referring to a person. So when I say the word I'm referring to me, but what kind of thing am I? And I would say, biblically speaking, we are immaterial substances, aka souls, that are again distinct from our bodies. We are not identical or reducible to our bodies. Now, while we're here on earth, obviously we are embodied, but again, we're not identical or reducible to something physical like a brain and body. Um, so aside from that, because again, we can spend the whole time just talking about that. We also see that 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about the resurrection. And I love how he puts it because he basically says that if there is no resurrection, then Christianity is false, full stop. In fact, he not only would it be false, he says, but people should actually feel sorry for us for how dumb and gullible we were to believe this stuff to begin with. So if there is no resurrection, Christianity is false. Well, I submit to you that if there's no soul, then there can be no resurrection as the Bible describes it, and thus Christianity would be false. You're asking about why Christians should care about this, and then you asked about Professor P, and I don't mind saying it here, Professor Pena, when I went to San Jacinto Community College in the Houston area. um, First, I think this has implications toward the truth of Christianity, because again, if there's no soul, there can be no resurrection. Now, I know there are Christian physicalists out there. I have friends who are Christian physicalists. I love them. I think they're wrong. And if you want to bring that up later, I mean, we can point to, for example, Jesus's interaction with the Sadducees. When he argues for resurrection, he essentially argues for the intermediate state of existence by pointing to the fact that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are still alive, though they're not physically present here on this earth. So that would imply disembodied existence, and he uses that as an argument to imply that they're awaiting a final resurrection. And so, for the Pharisaic Jewish mindset, and Jesus would have held to the theology of the Pharisees, especially in this aspect, it was a two-stage eschatology. There was intermediate state prior to final resurrection. So, Bible teaches that Jesus believed it. He argued for it. It has implications to the truth of Christianity. And then on top of all that, going now to my professor, he essentially, basically said religion wants us to believe in an immaterial soul, but here's a problem. And he pulls out this antidepressant pill and he says, if I took this antidepressant pill, which is something physical, it has a power to affect and change the states of my quote unquote soul, of my mind, which are supposed to be immaterial. But how is that possible? How could something physical affect the immaterial? And after a little bit more rhetoric, he basically said, well, scientists don't find it when they look at the body or the brain. And I'll tell you why that's the case, because there is no soul, there is no God, no heaven, no hell, no afterlife. We're just nothing but physics and chemistry all the way down. We're meat machines. We need to learn to live with that fact, get on with our lives, and stop believing in these fanciful, foolish fairy tales. Um, so I mean, that's kind of that answers what you asked. I don't know where you want me to go from there because I can go so many places. But essentially, it's taught in Scripture. Jesus believed it, argued for it. It has implications toward the truth of Christianity, and we live in a naturalized culture where a lot of things are reducible to the physical. And I can even show you how that plays out. And I know you've read the book, The Lazy Approach. I even talk about how this sentiment of naturalism has even crept into the church and we haven't realized it.
Yeah, no, it's so good. And I just want to reemphasize how important it is for Christians to know about the soul, given the implications of it with their faith in Christianity, with the resurrection, as you mentioned. I mean, we could have a whole conversation on Christian physicalism. I would love to hear your take on that more. Um, but, I just wonder, how did you, maybe paint the picture for us when you were in that room listening to Professor P say that? What was your initial thoughts, and what did you do after that? Is that what kicked you off into looking into the philosophy of mind, what findings did you come across? Like, how did that play out in your mind?
Yeah, good question. So my first thought was more like shock and confusion because I remember thinking, wait a minute, I thought everyone believed in the soul. And I knew he was an atheist, but I guess I just hadn't, pieced those things together. And that's another issue. And I was guilty of it myself. Christians tend to not be able to or even try to think holistically about the Christian worldview, the implications this has. Um, because, if there is a soul, then automatically naturalism is false. There is more to things in reality that are merely natural or physical. But if someone's a naturalist, then their best fit is to deny something like an immaterial substance that is a soul, and essentially argue for just pure physicalism, that all things are reducible and identical to something physical. And so first I was like, wow, I didn't know there were people who didn't believe in the soul. And then the second thought that crossed my mind was what I shared about 1 Corinthians 15. And I remember thinking, well, what shook me here was I thought to myself, well, for the first time in my life, I'm hearing an argument that if this is true, this would prove Christianity false. Because up until that time in his class, he had thrown out a lot of complaints against Christianity, but complaints don't make Christianity false. And yet, for the first time, freshman in college, I'm hearing an argument that if what he's saying is true, okay, this would prove, according to Scripture, that my faith is in vain. So, what do I do with it? Well, I could either ignore it, brush it under the rug, and move on with my life, which is not within my character to do, or I can roll my sleeves up and get into some metaphysics and some philosophy. And I ended up doing the latter. Now, at the time, I didn't really know what apologetics was. I don't even know if I had heard the word. Um, I hadn't even taken a deep dive in theology. This was my freshman year in college. And I mean, for the meantime, I kind of just tried to look up some stuff, but I mean, everything I'd find, it just wasn't. And granted, I was also looking in the wrong places. I didn't know who William Lane Craig was at the time either. So there was just a lot of things that, questions on my mind that I, had to wrestle with and think through. And lo and behold, sometime later, someone introduced me to William Lane Craig. And every time Craig would talk about the soul, he would always mention this guy named J.P. Moreland. Now I'm just getting into apologetics and learning what it is, and I'm thinking like, oh, I don't want to start following someone else. I'm still trying to, see where I agree or disagree with Craig. And then I went to an apologetic conference. Gosh, this was years ago, and I remember seeing J.P. Moreland's, and back then, they were selling CDs and DVDs, and I remember seeing like a sale, and it had Moreland, and it said like the life of the mind, and something about the soul. And so anyway, so I'm like, oh, it's on sale. I can get that, and I just really fell in love with his work. He's someone that I've been able to call a friend now, someone that I've been able to talk to a few times. In fact, I just spoke with him briefly a few weeks ago. But it was just so refreshing to not only see that there are logically consistent, legitimate answers to these questions, but there's a whole field of that, and then there's books on it. There's history on it. There's not just, and I'm not just talking apologetically. I'm talking about like deep philosophical metaphysics and how this even lines up with Scripture. But yeah, at the time, I didn't know where to go. I didn't know where to turn because there were no Christians in my life that did apologetics, that did philosophy, much less philosophy of mind.
Yeah, that's so big. And Um, our listeners know JP Moreland has accepted to forward the book that I'm writing. And it's a great honor because we were kind of talking about this before, but I feel like the whole book is based on his work. It's just he's done so much great work, especially on the soul, and the substance of consciousness is one of the bigger works that he released recently. And I mean, if you're looking for in-depth research, speaking to the listener here, you're going to want to find that. But he's also written books that are accessible to the lay Christian, that you can get it. I think it's called The Soul. How do we know it's real? Something to that effect. Smaller book, really clear, concise, and it gives you doesn't fall on truth at all. So JP Moreland is one of those guys I think every apologist looks to for philosophy of mind stuff.
Yeah.
Now you mentioned the Professor P and his argument against the soul, saying, well, scientifically, if you open up the brain, you're not going to find this and that. Then you said the word metaphysics. Can you just, for our listeners, define what metaphysics is, and then maybe we could loop that into the mind-body problem in general?
Yeah, great question. So, it's funny where it even gets a name because Aristotle wrote a book called like On the Physics or the Physics, and then he started writing a book regarding what we now call metaphysics, but at the time they didn't call it that. And I believe he either never titled it or he passed before he could title it or something like that. And so it was literally like, well, what should we title this one? It's like, well, I don't know, but it comes after his book on the physics, so let's call it Beyond the Physics, and literally it translates to metaphysics. Um, and essentially, metaphysics is the area of philosophy that gets really down to the very nature of reality itself, the nature of things. So this gets to questions like, what is the essence of a thing? So, for example, um, what's the difference between a tree and, let's just say, a dog, so to speak, right? These are both substances. Um, but, there's obviously we can look physically at the difference, but we also know that the physical is that there's something that grounds it, right? Because dogs can do certain things that trees can't, and vice versa. If I plant you, for example, in the ground, or a dog in the ground, it's not going to grow a root system and become a tree. Why? Because there's something about its essence, its nature, its underlying the components that are immaterial, the very essence of that thing. There are certain limitations that give rise to and helps us classify the kind of thing it is. Now, most people, when they think of classification, they think science, but science was at one point called natural philosophy. And science is in large based on philosophy and metaphysics. In fact, a lot of the we're talking about, you mentioned already, substance dualism. It's what I hold to, a view. Historically, it's a view that there are two substances. But we can just say, just to kind of simplify, there's something physical about me and something immaterial about me. And I would argue that I am an immaterial thing. Now, I mention that because a lot of times when I'm either debating or talking with atheists, sometimes they'll bring up, well, immaterial substance, because what is a soul? It's the immaterial substance that possesses consciousness and animates the body. But they'll say, well, wait a minute, immaterial substance, that's a contradiction. And I have to remind them that historically, first of all, the person who coined that phrase was Aristotle. And when he first used it to talk about substances, he was talking about immaterial things, because the word substance means to stand under, or like a submarine is under, it's to substand, to stand under the thing. So when you look at anything, again, look at a dog. It has a shape, it has a weight, it has a color. But what is a thing that is grounding all of that? Because properties, now we're going a little bit more philosophical here. Properties are basically attributes or characteristics. Typically, their words end in NESS, like evenness, or ITY, triangularity. These are properties, but when we see properties show up in the world, they don't just float around by themselves. They're always grounded in something. So, for example, when I drive down the highway, I don't avoid hitting the property of redness. I avoid an object that grounds or possesses a property of redness. So all this is metaphysics. And when we look at anything in reality, we're essentially asking, when we're doing metaphysics, what is the essence or nature of this thing? What makes it what it is? Then you get into things like essential properties versus accidental or contingent properties. Briefly touch on that since I brought it up. Uh, if you were to change my hair color, am I still Eric Hernandez? If I change my hair, if it went from dark brown to blue, am I still Eric Hernandez? Well, yes, I am. So what that tells us is that my hair color is not an essential property. It's what Aristotle would call accidental, or we can say contingent. It doesn't have to be that way. So I can change certain things, certain characteristics about me, and if it doesn't change the kind of thing I am or who I am, then in a real sense, we can say that these are not essential. Essential properties are the properties that, if you were to take this away, then I cease to be the thing that I am or that I was. For example, the number two is even. If somehow you could remove evenness from the number two, it would cease to be the number two, because it's essential for the number two, if it exists, to be even. So, I mean, we can talk more about this, but hopefully that answers a question. Stop me anytime, please. Because I love talking this stuff. But yeah, so metaphysics gets into the nature, the essence, what are essential, non-essential properties of a thing, and what makes something the kind of thing that it is.
Mm. No, that's so good. And I think, the way you phrased it is so easy for us to remember. A dog and then a tree, like there's two different substances, and that comes with, as a consequence, certain properties. And that's kind of what my book hones in on, is this substance of the unborn. Pro choicers will say that it's performance based, that your personhood is depending on what you do, what you can do. And then secular pro-lifers, who, and secular, I mean not invoking God, will say, no, it's rooted in a rational human nature. And I agree with that. And even in the book, I say I give the case for why that's true. But I say, but what is that rational human nature? Well, what grounds that? And that's where I get into the Imago Dei. So you can just see the connection there. It's so important to understand the substance and the property. So I'm so glad you were able to distinguish those. Now, I want to ask you, what are the competing worldviews here? So you said substance dualism. I'll just list them here. Maybe you could define them for us. Physicalism and property dualism. How would you define those two? And which one would you say is most prominent today?
Yeah, so good question. It kind of depends where you're at, who you're talking to, but so you mentioned physicalism and property dualism, and to recap, I'm a substance dualist, so there is something physical about me and something immaterial. Um, the other end of the spectrum would be what we can call strict physicalism. And it's essentially the idea that there's only one type of substance, namely physical substance. So every attribute, every property about me is going to be identical or reducible to something physical. So, for example, as a substance dualist, and I'm sure we'll get into this, I would argue that consciousness is not physical, it's immaterial. Well, if you hold to physicalism, well, then you're going to have to, whatever properties you possess are going to have to be something physical, not just even grounded in the physical, but something physical. So I would argue consciousness is immaterial. The physicalist would have to argue, and no, it's not immaterial. It is something physical. So immediately, to even figure out which of these two is correct, we just have to look at the nature of consciousness. Then you mentioned what's called property dualism. Property dualism, and this can get kind of sticky really quick, but essentially, it's the idea that there is still only one substance, something physical, but this physical substance can produce or ground or possess immaterial properties. So the property dualist will say, well, there's only one substance, but there are two types of properties: physical properties and material properties. I think that one has problems, but those would kind of be the three major views. And there is technically a fourth one, like an idealist kind of view, where rather than, I mean, each one of these have their own camps, right? But essentially, it's like almost the opposite of physicalism, where everything is something immaterial, where there's information or mental or things of that nature.
That's really helpful. Um, I want to hone in on the consciousness, but I think that'll be a subsequent topic when we first touch on the soul. So if you could just define what is the soul, and then maybe go into the evidence for the soul, and I think that's where consciousness will be brought up. So let's start with, what is the soul properly defined?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, as I mentioned earlier, the soul would be an immaterial substance that possesses or grounds consciousness and animates the body. So, on that definition, and anytime I want to make a case for the soul, I argue two basic points. The first is that consciousness is not physical, it's immaterial. And the second is that I am more than a brain and body, I am a soul. Now, before going further, some people think, well, to answer this question, we just need to go to science. And the problem with that is that if the soul exists, then it's a question about metaphysics, not about the physical. It's about the metaphysical. Science is only limited to the physical. So in principle, if the soul does exist, you can't do science or use science to try and investigate it or answer the question. Here's an analogy. Suppose there are two neighbors arguing, and you want to go find out what's going on, why they're arguing, and then they're both mad at each other, and so you ask the neighbor whose house is right next to yours. You're like, so what happened? You're like, well, I told this guy that there's an invisible man in my house, and he kept telling me that I was making this up, so I invited him to come investigate for himself. And so he came over and he spent 2 hours in my house investigating. And 2 hours later, he comes out and then he accuses me of lying. And I asked him, why do you think I'm lying? And he said, well, because you claim there's an invisible man in your house. And yet I looked everywhere and I never saw him. I looked under the bed, I looked in the closet, I looked in the attic, and I never once saw this invisible man. And of course, the guy's like, see what I'm saying? This guy's, he's an idiot. Why would you try and look for something invisible? Of course, you couldn't see it. It's invisible. Now, what this shows is that if the skeptical neighbor wants to disprove this person who's claiming there's an invisible man in his house, then while the neighbor's response that, of course, you can't see him, he is invisible, that doesn't prove he's right, but it at the very least tells us that if he wants to disprove it, he cannot appeal to his sense of sight to disprove something invisible, because being invisible would be both consistent with and predicted by the very thing in question. So you cannot use a lack of visibility to argue against something that is by definition invisible. In the same way, to try and use science to answer the question of what is a soul or whether or not a soul exists would be, again, like trying to use your eyes to look for something invisible. It's just a wrong tool for the assessment. So, what do we use? We use essentially, I'll give you the big phrase first, and then we'll pick a simpler one. We use Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals. And, the listeners can go and press somebody with that later on. But essentially, we can just call it Leibniz's law or Leibniz's law of identity. And it's relatively simple, but it's very profound. So, if two things in question, say some A or B, if we're talking about the same thing, then whatever's true of A is going to be true of B and vice versa. So to illustrate really quick, if I said the guest on your show right now, and then in the next breath I said Eric Hernandez, I'm not talking about two people, I'm talking about one. Why? Because Eric Hernandez and the guest on your show right now are identical. In philosophy, when we say two things are identical, we mean they are literally the same thing. So Eric Hernandez is literally the same as the guest on your show right now. So again, this is Leibniz's law, or really just law of identity. Now, where Leibniz's law comes in is Leibniz's law says, well, if two things in question are identical, and aside from the simple fact that they should all possess the same properties and that they should all share the same characteristics, if we can find just one thing true of, let's say, A that's not true of B, like Eric Hernandez and the guest on your show, if we can find just one thing true of one that's not true of the other, then they cannot be the same thing. So, with this in mind, I'll give you one more quick illustration. Speaking of science, suppose I walk into a lab and I see two bottles of clear fluid. And one bottle is labeled water and the other says, let's say, chemical X. Now, let's suppose further, though, that the bottle labeled chemical X, let's say the label was ripped off and I couldn't read it. So what I'm going to do is, without using any lab equipment, I'm going to assess whether or not these are the same substances. And what I'm going to do is look at their properties. So I see that they're both fluid. They're in a liquid state. They're both clear. They feel like they kind of both weigh the same. And I think, well, then I guess whatever, whatever chemical X is, it must be the same thing as this other bottle, this bottle of water, H2O. But then suppose I turn over chemical X and on the back of it, I see another label that says cautioned flammable. Well, now I just got an epiphany because I know that water's not flammable. And since water's not flammable, I now know that whatever this substance is, it possesses a property that water does not, and thus they cannot be the same thing, even if I initially thought they were. So that's Leibniz's law of identity. Now let's go back to my 2 points. The first is that consciousness is not physical. And the second is that I am more than a brain and body. I am a soul. Now, just sticking to the first, all we have to do is take a look at if we're trying to adjudicate between, let's just say, substance dualism or physicalism and ask ourselves which one, where does the evidence point to? Let's start with consciousness. Now, without going too deep, consciousness comes in 5 states. What is consciousness? It's something that you would have to define in what's called an ostensive way, meaning I can't necessarily give you a definition. Rather, I have to point to an example of it or give you kind of show you. For example, colors are defined ostensibly in this way as well. Let's say I discovered a color you had never seen. Well, how would I describe it to you? I mean, I could try, but only because you've already seen color. But the easiest thing to do is just point to it and say, that color back there, that's the color I'm talking about. But note, if someone was born blind, how would you describe the color purple to them? Well, you couldn't, because colors, again, are defined ostensibly. You have to point to examples of it. You have to basically show it, like here it is. Consciousness is the same way, but the great thing about consciousness is that anybody you're talking with is going to be conscious. And there are 5 states of consciousness. There are thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will, or we could say volition. 5 states of consciousness. Now, when you take these 5 states, what we can do then is we can look at its properties and assess what is the nature of this thing. For example, water is a substance, it's a physical substance that can come in 3 different states. And if I told you, hey, I have water right now, right next to me, and it has a property of solidity, you would immediately know that, okay, it must be frozen. It's in a hard state. So knowing the properties can inform me of the state and the kind of thing that needs to ground or possess it. All right. All that to say, let's now look at the states of the mind and the states of something physical like the brain. Why? because remember, physicalism is true, then the mind would have to be identical, which we've already established means literally the same thing as, or reducible to, meaning we can break it down and say, no, it's just something physical, to something physical. And the best candidate here would be like the brain, or we could even say brain and central nervous system. So if the mind and brain are the same thing, then given Leibniz's law of identity, not only must they possess all the same properties, but they must also not have something that can be true of one that's not true of the other, or vice versa. Which means if we can show just one thing true of the mind that's not true of the brain, or vice versa, we can immediately logically deduce, without even leaving our chairs, that consciousness is not physical but immaterial. And this is relatively easy to do, but I'll just give you 3 examples. So let's take a state of my mind like a belief. My beliefs can be true or false. Now let's look at the brain. If the mind and brain are the same thing, then again, they must share the same properties, and whatever's true of one must be true of the other. My beliefs can be true or false. But take a brain state. When I have a thought, there are neurons firing in my brain. But note, while we can confidently say there's a correlation between thoughts and neurons firing, they're not identical or reducible to each other. Why? Because my thought can be true or false, but neurons firing are not true or false. It makes no sense for a neurosurgeon to look at your brain during a brain scan and say, oh, those neurons over there that are firing, those are firing false, but these over here, they're firing true. It's just a category fallacy there. A second example, my brain can be in a state that weighs, let's say, 3 pounds, but the thought that I'm talking to you right now doesn't weigh 3 pounds. While the listeners may be having heavy thoughts right now, they're not going to need to buy a neck brace when we're done here. I'll be here all week. And one last one, let's look at sensations. My brain can be in a state that measures 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana, which is a sensation in my mind, doesn't measure 7 inches long. It makes no sense to ask how many inches long was the taste of that banana you just ate. Again, these are not the same categories. Now, well, there's lots more we can go into. If all the properties of my mind are not physical and all the properties of my brain are physical, well, then it follows that consciousness, if it exists, it cannot be identical or reducible to the physical. And if consciousness exists and can't be physical, then physicalism can't be true.
That's so good. And I love the law of identity because you talk about it in the chapter in Faith Examined, but also in your book, The Lazy Approach. And JP has said this, if you are your brain, and actually Michael Egnor as well from Cornell University, who just wrote The Immortal Mind, yeah, amazing book. Have it back there somewhere. If he's a neurosurgeon and he's taken out a lot of parts of the brain before, and these people are still walking around. But surely if you only have 80% of your brain, doesn't mean you're only 80% of a person. You're still a full person, just with less of a brain. But if physicalism is true, you'd have to conclude that you're 80% of a person. That just seems wildly counterintuitive. So I just think the law of identity is so clear in that respect. Yeah, that's really good stuff. I mean, I'm curious, Eric. I've seen you debate some atheists, like on your TikTok. You post all those clips, and the commenters do not like it. I will say similar to the comments in our section. What is the biggest, when in a live debate, right, with an atheist, like when you say the law of identity, because that seems very convincing to me. What is the biggest pushback that you get from them, or the most common one?
Yeah, and I'll try to be as nice as possible. It's a really bad objection, and it's essentially the argument of basically correlation or dependence. So they'll say yeah, well, neuroscientists have discovered that certain parts of the brain are responsible for certain parts of mental functions, and if you get something like brain damage or Alzheimer's, it affects the function of memory, and you lose memory. And I'm like, yep. Therefore, what? This is, I mean, I'm not. I make up some stuff. This stuff I'm not making up. But it's so odd to me. Therefore, what does that prove, right? Now, what they're implicitly assuming or trying to argue is that therefore they're the same thing, but that doesn't follow. So remember, I told you earlier. This is a good segue to kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone. That when Christians don't understand this, know how to think through this, and don't understand good philosophy and metaphysics, they can easily fall prey by not thinking holistically to some of the implications of these worldviews. When I go to churches and I give a talk on either the lazy approach or worldview, like naturalism, something like that, after explaining what it is, I like to do a little bit of audience interaction. And I tell the audience, I say, do me a favor. Can you please point to what part of your body thinks? And everybody does this, right? And to clarify, I say, okay, brain, is that what y'all are saying? Everybody says yes. And I'm like, okay, do you need a brain to think? They say yes. Does your brain think? They say yes. I'm like, all right. And then I say, let me switch gears here. God the Father, does God the Father have a brain? Then it gets uncomfortably quiet. And then I always jokingly say, like, I'm not in a Mormon church, right? And I kind of, kind of look to my right and left, making sure I'm not in some like Mormon ward. And after I verify, these aren't Mormons, I'm like, because the answer should easily, without hesitation, be no. God the Father does not have a brain. The Bible says that God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And yet they told me earlier that it's a brain that thinks, and you need a brain to think. So then I asked, well, are you made in his image? Of course, the answer is yes. What does God think? The answer is yes. The Bible says that his thoughts toward us are more than the grains of sand, but he doesn't have a brain. So then it's like, well, wait a minute. Now we've come against a conundrum. And the short answer is essentially this, kind of killing two birds with one stone here. Suppose I were to take a piano and I can show you. In fact, I remember my father did this when we were younger. He bought like a piano, and it didn't have the notes on each of the keys weren't like listed or written on there. So he wanted to kind of try to show us, and what he's like naturally talented musically. And so what he did was he just kind of would press the keys, listen, and he'd be able to like write down, okay, this is this note and whatnot. Now imagine if someone were to say, well, hey, don't let that thing fall down, because if it breaks, all the notes are going to spill out all over the floor. And you're going to have to clean them up. Well, no one would think that. Why? Because we know that while there is a correlation, and we can even say dependence on a certain note being played, depending on and correlated with certain keys on the piano, it doesn't follow that notes and keys are reducible to the physical parts of the piano, or that the notes are literally inside of the piano. And even if I were to argue, yeah, but look, if I broke these keys, you can no longer play the note C, I would say, yep. Therefore, what? Therefore, the notes are the same thing as the keys, or that they're inside the piano? No, of course not. So what's odd to me that, sure, while we're embodied, yes, absolutely. While I am in this body, if you affect parts of my brain, you will affect parts of my mind. And we can even talk later that it's a two-way street. Not only can the brain affect the soul, but the soul can affect the brain. What we see is that, yes, there are these correlations, but first of all, it didn't take neuroscience to discover this. I'm sure cavemen understood that if you drink enough type of alcohol, or if you get hit over the head really hard with the rock, or a club, you're going to get dizzy. So affecting a part of my head that affects my mind, that's no new epiphany. So when the pushback is like, yeah, but look, there's a correlation, I'm like, right. Are you assuming dualists don't think correlations exist? Like, I mean, it's so odd to me. And then an even weirder one is when people are like, well, show me a mind without a brain. And the first thing I say is, well, I'm not necessarily arguing, at least not now, that there are minds without brains. Like, that's a separate question. I'm just showing it's immaterial. Whether or not there could exist a mind without a brain is irrelevant to the fact that consciousness is immaterial. That's it's immediately a straw man. But of course, if Christianity is true, you have at the foundation of reality an immaterial mind, God, three persons, immaterial without a brain. Nevertheless, they'll say, show me a mind without a brain. And I'm like, okay, I'd love to, but before I can do that, do me a favor and first show me a mind.
Yeah.
Like how can I show you a mind without a brain if first I need to know what do you mean by mind? And sometimes I even like get a piece of paper. Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I'll get a piece of paper, and I'll put like the word brain on one side, and I'll put mind on the other side. And I'm like, okay, show me a mind. And they'll point to neurons firing. And I'm like, nope, that's a brain. I'm looking for a mind. And they'll say, well, they can do brain scans, and they can, see what you're thinking, with an image. I'm like, nope, you're still showing me brain. I want a mind. And so it's like it's as if the argument just goes over their heads, sadly. But that's kind of the most common, most popular objection to that kind of argument. And unfortunately, it's terrible.
Yeah, wow. I mean, it seems like they're not understanding what substance dualism is. Like, they think it's two, like there's a body and then there's a little pocket for a soul, and the soul just sits there and does nothing, and you could take it out and put it back in. That's not at all what it's like. You mentioned it animates the body, and I think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, more of a Thomistic approach of the soul. Now, just so for our listeners are aware, because this might come up, can you distinguish between the Cartesian idea of the soul and then the Thomistic idea, or the Aristotle idea, I think it is, of the soul?
Yeah, so like Cartesian dualism
Yes,
and like a
Cartesian. Yes.
Thomistic like dualism.
Mm.
So again, there are different flavors and camps within these two broad views, but to give you the short version, so I would hold to a Thomistic like dualism. I think Moreland calls his view Aristotelian metaphysicalism or metaphysical Aristotelianism, one of those two. I always get them. I may have some dyslexia, so but yeah, Moreland says he confesses to be a peeping Thomist. So I Most Thomists will hold to something like known as hylomorphism, but that may be deeper than what we need to go. But they think that a human person is a composite of both soul and body. I would argue that I am at my core an immaterial substance, which is a soul. And while I am most naturally embodied, it's not essential to who I am to be embodied. And then but on this view, there's a very deep integration between the soul and body. It's like a perfect fit, if you will. It's the soul is a thing that drives even the formation of the body. Again, something we can go really long into. But let's just say that the reason I have the kind of body that I have is because of the kind of soul that I am. And the reason a dog has a dog body is because a dog has a dog soul. And so what that does is that, for example, my eyes don't see, my soul sees, but it uses my eyes to see. Now, granted, if you plucked out my eyes, I wouldn't be able to see, but if you would somehow could replace them with new ones, I could see. Why? Because within my nature, my essence, I have the capacity for sight, and thus the soul essentially forms a body and begins to develop certain parts that allow it to utilize a capacity it has. Now, this gets really fascinating because this is how we can look at the physical and deduce things about the metaphysical. So, if we could, for example, look at what part of the brain is responsible for, say, language, we can say, oh, then, this thing, whatever we're looking at, has a capacity for language. And then metaphysically, we know, oh, because of the kind of soul that it is. But let's say then we look at a dog brain and we see it's missing that part that is responsible for language. Well, then that tells us a little bit more about the nature of dogs and the kind of thing a dog is. On the other hand, for the Cartesian dualist, essentially they would reduce the soul and mind and make them synonymous. On my view, I am a soul, and there are certain faculties of my soul, and one of those faculties is my faculty of mind. So I'm not just a mind or reducible to the mind. For Cartesians, that's typically where it goes to. Maybe not all, but essentially that the mind and the soul are the same thing, and it's almost like a perhaps an external connection to the body, whereas on a Thomistic like view, this kind of substance dualist view, the soul is the very thing that drives the body and is like diffused all throughout the body. That's kind of the short version.
Hey everyone, just wanted to pause here for a minute and thank you for listening to the Truthful Hope podcast. We hope you've been enjoying the episode so far. To help us with our mission of sharing the hope of Christianity with as many people as possible, please consider subscribing to our podcast and leaving your thoughts and questions in the comments. You could find us on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Furthermore, if you'd like to make a monetary contribution, please consider donating at truthfulhope.com/donate. As a 501c3 nonprofit, your donation may be tax deductible and you'll receive a receipt for your records. Thanks again, and now back to the show. Well, I appreciate it because I think, when I'm looking through the comments and even some of the debates and kind of the pushback that you were saying, it just seems like the idea of substance dualism is unclear, at least in the way that we mean it. And I think it's because of those terms and those frameworks that are being operated from. I don't think, at least the opposition doesn't have a clear understanding of where exactly we're coming from. It's easy to sneak in confusion. So I'm glad we were able to settle that distinction. Now I
And,
do
and
want to
I'll
go
even
in. Oh,
say,
go ahead.
I'll just say one more thing. It's also because a word to my to the atheist listeners out there: stop assuming that every Christian doctrine is just so dumb and stupid, and that you just have to think for 5 seconds. You're like, oh, I see the problem, because quite frankly, these objections are dumb and stupid. In other words, I would say before you critique a view, learn it. Learn what it is and what they believe, so you're not straw manning. I can't tell you how many atheists I've talked to online, and you can find on my YouTube channel. In fact, I had a discussion on the soul with Tom Jump, and he started the discussion with something like, when we got to that topic, is something like, "Well, there are no arguments. There are no good arguments for the soul." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, interesting." I'm like, "Well," I said, "Can you give me the top 3 arguments that you've heard?" He goes, "Well, I don't know, but they're all bad." I'm like, "Okay, I'm not asking you for one that you think is convincing. I just said, just give me the top 3. What even if they're really bad arguments, what are the top 3 bad arguments?" And he goes, "Well, it's been a long time. I can't remember." I'm like, "Oh, that's fine." I'm like, "Well, how about just tell me the top 3 books you've read on substantialism?" And he's like, "Well, I haven't read any actual books on it." I'm like, "Oh, okay, well, cool. Well, how about this? Just tell me the top 3 philosophers of mind, whether they're dualist or physical, whatever." He goes, "I can't name any." I'm like, "Huh." So you can't name any argument, not one book or even any scholar. And he's like, "Oh, that doesn't matter. That's not my point." I'm like, "All right, whatever." Point being is, though, it's like, yeah, I think it goes over the person's head, because they just think, "Oh, this is so ridiculous that, they can just dismantle it by just thinking a little bit harder," when in reality, they're not even on the same page as we are, because they don't even understand the philosophy behind it, the metaphysics behind it.
Right. Yeah, and those are great questions to kind of prowl at it's easy to just dismiss that when someone says, "Oh, well, there's no good arguments." And you did a great job of just honing in on that. Well, what are those arguments? I love that. That's that's something that our listeners should keep in mind. Because, in reality, when you're dealing with like on the street with people and you bring up the soul, I think despite that percentage that I mentioned, the 83%, most likely, especially from a skeptic, you're going to get like, "Oh, okay, whatever, sure you believe that." Or at least people believe it, but they don't really have the reasons for why they believe it. And I think that's equally as problematic. So um, it's good to have these discussions, and it's good to do the research, like you said. But that whole issue of failing to look into the opposition, I think, is a general issue across the board. We see it all over social media. Everything that's debated is like they look at the surface level, maybe a clip on TikTok, whatever it is, and that's their research. And then they go and debate it. And it's like, you need to do a lot more than that, at least to have a substantive conversation. But I did want to bring up NDEs because you're talking about, the eyes. You see in this, you see from the capacity from your soul, and then you see with the eyes physically. Uh, I talk about in the book NDEs because they're such a powerful example of verified data that we have of disembodied souls seeing, like blind people seeing, that's been reported. I mean, that's amazing. So I'm tempted to say, for the physicalist that said, "Show me a mind without a brain," I'm tempted to just send him the articles on NDEs and say, "Here you go." I don't know.
Yeah, they usually I so when I love, reading about NDEs, and, there's some really great books. There's some more, even, like, scientifically heady or bent, supporting NDEs. In fact, I think it was University of Michigan, their publishing group put out a book. I think it's called The Science of Near Death Experiences. It's not a Christian publication, it's not a Christian book. It's just scientists who got the research together and looked into this. And it's actually growing. This field is growing, even by secular, non believing, non Christian scholars looking into near death experiences, because they're happening more and more, which would make sense that our technology is improving. And so we're able to bring people back a lot better. Nevertheless, when I do debates on the soul, I really just stick to these 2 points, and we can go to the second one, shortly. 1, consciousness is not physical, and 2, I'm more than a brain and body, I'm a soul. And just that alone is sufficient, because usually with NDEs, they either, they'll say, "Well, I have to look up these scientists, or I have to look these things up." They're just not gonna take your word for it, so to speak, even though if you give them peer reviewed, people are weird, let's just put it that way. But yeah, so if let's say we've established so far that consciousness is not physical. Now we go to my second point. I am more than a brain and body. Now, recall earlier I said that when properties show up in the world, they don't just float around by themselves. They're always grounded or possessed by something. So we know that consciousness exists. we've established, let's say that it's immaterial. Then the question is, well, what is the thing that grounds or possesses it? And I immediately and 100% confident with 100% certainty know that there's at least one thing that is conscious, and that's me. I am conscious. I possess consciousness. But now the question arises, well, what kind of thing am I? Now, here's where we want to kind of get into some a little bit deeper metaphysics. So when you look at let's talk about what are called again, the big phrase is mereological aggregates, and we'll explain what that means. So when I use the word I, again, I'm referring to me, the self, and I would argue that I, the self, am not something physical. I am something immaterial. So technically speaking, I am a soul. I am identical to my soul. I don't have a soul, but rather I am a soul, and a body without a soul would just be a corpse. So, with this in mind, let's suppose for the sake of argument that physicalism is true. Let's just kind of try on that hat. There is no soul, everything is physical. Well, human beings would be what you call mereological aggregates. What does that mean? It is a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. Now, so if you think of things like Lego bricks, watches, cars, these are what philosophers would call aggregates. We can call it that for short, aggregates. A collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. Now, here's the interesting thing about aggregates. Imagine, if you will, a tricycle. It has, by definition, 3 wheels. If I remove one of the wheels from the tricycle, then we can say in a metaphysical sense, a tricycle has ceased to exist and a bicycle has come into existence. And what this tells us is that aggregates, their existence and identity necessarily depend on the properties, parts, and the structure. Their physical properties, parts, and structure. So let's now do a thought experiment. Because what this will show us also is that aggregates do not maintain strict identity through change or part replacement. So take something like a car. And this is like my updated version of Theseus's ship. So if I replace the tires on a car, we can ask, is it the same car? And, some people say yes. But let's suppose now we replace every single nut and bolt on that car. The windshield, the bumper, everything on the car is replaced. Is it the same car? But then before you answer that question, let's take those replaced parts and put those back together. And now you have 2 cars side by side. And then you can ask which one of these 2 is the original, if either one is. Now, regardless of your answer, I think we can all agree they both can't be the original, if there is an original still there. And what that shows us again is that when it comes to aggregates, purely physical objects, their existence and identity necessarily depend on the properties in their parts. So, with this in mind, let's go to one of our first syllogisms for the second point, that I am more than a brain and body, I am a soul. So let's go with, I'm trying to think which one I want to use. Let's go with identity through change, since we're already on that topic. We know from science that every 7 to 10 years, we replace virtually every cell in our body. Now, let's suppose physicalism is true. The syllogism would be premise 1, and this is known as a disjunctive syllogism, if anyone is wondering. I'm either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or I am an immaterial soul. Now, if I'm a purely physical object, an aggregate, I do not retain identity through change and part replacement. So, every 7 to 10 years, we know that we replace virtually every cell in our body. Now, let's suppose for the sake of argument that 7 to 10 years ago, I committed a crime. But then 7 to 10 years later, they find the evidence for it. And then all of a sudden, as we're talking, I get a knock on my door, and I open it, and lo and behold, it's J. Warner Wallace. And he's like, hey, Eric, we just found the evidence to convict you of this crime that you committed 7 to 10 years ago. Now, imagine if I said, Jay, come on. You know that we're just purely physical objects. And who you're really looking for is a different set of properties and parts. So go find that person, but good luck, because they don't exist, but that's certainly not me. He's going to look at me and say, nope, sorry, going to have to take you in, and slaps on the cuffs. Why? Because we know that we do retain identity through change or part replacement, which means I'm not a purely physical object, therefore I am a soul. Now, Jaegwon Kim, an atheist philosopher of mind, again, not a Christian, he made a similar argument in his book on philosophy of mind, as he was going through the arguments for dualism. And I think I like this one better. He basically says, in 2001, this brain and body did not exist. However, I did exist in 2001. Therefore, I'm not identical or reducible to a brain and body. So pretty intuitive, pretty straightforward. Let's go to one more. And you were alluding to this earlier, and this has implications for abortion as well. The argument from the indivisibility of personhood. Now, a little bit more philosophy. So bear with me, everyone who's listening. And great thing is that this is recorded, so you can go back and look at the terminology. So let's say that we have this question. Again, first premise is going to be, I'm either an aggregate, purely physical object, or an immaterial substance, a soul. Now, the first thing we want to do is ask ourselves, is personhood a degreed or non-degreed property? What does that mean? Okay, so let's now talk about degreed and non-degreed. Essentially, a degreed property is a property that can come in percentages or degrees. It can exist in percentages or degrees. It can be divided. So, for example, let's say the property of being hard or loud. These are properties that can fluctuate or change. Something can be louder or harder or softer or quieter. By contrast, let's look at non-degreed properties. These would be properties that cannot exist or fluctuate or change. They cannot move in degrees. They are all or nothing kind of things. So the property of evenness would fall under this category. If I took the number 2 and the number 6, we know that they're both even, but it makes no sense to say that the number 6 is, quote, more even than the number 2. Why? Because evenness is a non-degreed property. It's all or nothing kind of thing. There is no in between. All right. Now that we've established that, let's now look at, I am either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or an immaterial soul. Well, purely physical objects can be divided and exist in various percentages or degrees. So now we go to what you were talking about earlier. If we take a table and cut it in half, and let's say we burn one half, we could say that there is 50% of a table. But if, God forbid, I got in an accident and lost my limbs, we could say that I have 50% of a body, but we couldn't or wouldn't or shouldn't say that I am therefore 50% of a person. In other words, we can ask ourselves this question: does having more mass and matter mean that you matter more? Now, we typically attribute value to human beings, regardless of size or shape. But if physicalism were true, then human value or personhood would have to be grounded in something physical, but we know the physical can fluctuate and change. The physical can be and exist degreed. In other words, men are typically larger than women, but I don't think anyone would want to say that men are more valuable or more persons than women, right? So we know that, again, you can divide my body in half and I can have 50% of a body, but I'm not 50% of a person. Otherwise, people who had more mass and matter would matter more. Now, some physicalists might say, well, it's not the body per se, it's the brain. Same problem. There have been operations where they remove parts of a person's brain. There are diseases, conditions where some people are only born with, say, 75% of a brain. Now, note, we can ask the same question. Are these people 75% persons, or are they 100% persons that just have 75% functioning? And if that's the case, the second, well, then it also shows that I'm not identical or reducible to my function. I'm not reducible or identical to my ability. Because once you start going down that rabbit trail, this is where things like eugenics comes in. Because, I am more valuable because I'm smarter. I can do more. I can do better. And then value becomes placed on some physical ability or functionality. But if everyone is equal, if all human beings possess dignity and intrinsic value and worth, well, then let's go back to, I'm either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. If I'm a purely physical object, then then purely physical objects can exist in percentages or degrees. I cannot exist in percentages or degrees. I'm an all or nothing kind of thing. I'm either a person or I'm not a person, right? We don't look at someone that, let's say, is only 2-3 feet tall, 4 feet tall, and say, wow, that's less of a person than the other guy. Why? Because, again, the mass and matter isn't what grounds a personhood. But if physicalism were true, that would have to be the thing that grounds personhood. And thus, someone who had more mass and matter would essentially matter more. But given that I'm an all or nothing kind of thing, it follows that, therefore, I am not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul.
It's so good. And, it's intuitive. I think largely we know this. Like, if we just take a few seconds to introspect, which you'd have to use your consciousness for, you would know that you're not just your brain. Also, to say that if you're just if you are your body, like if you're the same as your body or your brain, it also kind of throws out human equality because we're all different in so many different aspects. Some of us are way more, some of us are taller, some of us are smarter, more aware. So you remove the whole and the whole thing entirely. Now we're actually at the top of the hour. Do you have a few minutes to go over? Is that okay with you, or are
Yeah,
you
yeah,
a
good.
hard stop? Okay, because I want to touch
Go
on
f
a couple objections, the ones I see most in the comments, and overwhelmingly, actually. The first one is consciousness is physical because it just emerges once matter organizes to a certain complexity. And this is typically paired with like a Darwinian evolution thing where, oh, well, matter just came about in such a way where consciousness was freed. How would you respond to this kind of objection?
I would ask them to prove it, that how that proves consciousness is physical. Again, this goes back to, so in the book, sorry, in the chapter that you mentioned, I say something like, cause or dependence does not establish identity. Showing a correlation or dependence between two things doesn't prove they're the same thing. If anything, if you think about it, cause and effect or dependence already assumes two things are in question. So if A causes B, then automatically A is not the same thing as B if it's causing B. Um, Moreland would use something like, fire causes smoke, but fire and smoke aren't the same thing. Now, this objection is saying something like, okay, but they're either alluding to emergence or cause and effect. But let's even look at this. Even if I don't grant that consciousness emerges from the physical, and there's even something to be said there about that statement itself. But let's suppose it did. That wouldn't prove it's not physical. Property dualists concede that mental properties are not physical. They will argue, however, that they're grounded in the physical or produced by the physical, like the brain. But note, they don't automatically assume, therefore, the mind is physical. That's why they're property dualists. So even if someone could show or demonstrate or prove that the mind, quote unquote, emerges from the brain, that wouldn't prove it's physical. That would only prove it's caused by something physical.
Hmm.
I don't think sound is physical. I don't think colors are physical. Yet I think, though, if you can mess with matter in some sense, you can perceive color or hear sound. And why do I think that? I'll give you the quick answer because I know there's probably some atheists who are like, oh, he's so dumb. Of course, light waves and radio, all this stuff. Um, Everybody right now could close their eyes and think of a pink elephant and see that pink elephant in their mind while listening to their favorite song. And guess what? There is no light in your brain and there are no waves going on in there. And yet you have color and you have music or sound, if you will. Now, is it quote unquote physical sound? Well, again, I could literally hear a song right now in my mind, but there's nothing carrying those waves. Why? Because it's sound in and of itself. Yes, it's correlated by physical. Yes, there's correlations to wavelengths for light. But again, if I can see color with my eyes closed and there's no light in there, it must not be identical or reducible to the physical, even if we commonly see them together. Now let's talk about the emergence part. I love Moreland's response to this. He says, no, in fact, Jaegwon Kim, and maybe even Thomas Nagel, two atheist philosophers of mind, they'll basically say, well, look, calling it emergence doesn't solve the problem. You're just putting a name on it.
Right,
That doesn't solve what's called the hard problem of consciousness. So just saying, oh, look, we don't know what to do with this. How does it work? Let's call it emergence. We did our job. That doesn't prove anything. That doesn't say anything. You're just putting a label on it. On top of that, so emergence, depending on what kind of emergentist you talk to, here are the kind of properties that can emerge. And what you typically are going to get, I would say, what you're always going to get for the most part. There may or may not be some exceptions, but let's look at what are called structural properties. Suppose I have in front of me a pile of wooden boards. We can say that this pile of wooden boards possess the property of being a pile. And then I can now take a hammer and nails, rearrange these, and I can make a ladder. Now note, all I have done was rearrange and reassess and restructure the base parts, and I now get a new property. These base parts now possess a property of being a ladder instead of being a pile. Did a new property emerge? Sure, it's a new structural property, but it's not a new, completely different non-physical property. That's the kind of thing you would need for consciousness to emerge from just rearranging matter, and we don't see that. There's no evidence of that at all. It would be like, because to say that consciousness emerges from rearranging matter would be to like say that the color blue can emerge rather by rearranging the red bricks on a house. There's no configuration of red bricks, no amount you can add or take away that are going to emerge the color blue from red bricks. So yeah, I mean, you tell me where you want to go from there.
No, that's great. I love that last illustration too. I haven't thought about that. I mean, you mentioned Moreland's response. I pretty much take that approach, and I just ask how. Like we talked about this in our last conversation. Like, if you make the claim, you bear the burden of proof. That's a massive claim, and good luck bearing that burden. I don't know how you do it, because it really just rephrases the problem a different way. I love how you said that. That last illustration was really good too. The last objection, though, the second one, this is really common, and it actually comes up less in the comments, but more in like regular conversations that I've had. I'll talk about the soul, and they'll say, well, how does the immaterial soul interact with the physical body? How does that happen? And I'm curious to get your thoughts on it, on this kind of objection.
Yeah, well, first let's to be clear, it's not an objection actually. It's a question. Yeah, that's another thing is it's not even an objection, but people ask it as if it is. I think it was William Hasker who said the most overrated objection in philosophy is the interaction problem. How does the soul interact with the body? There's like a number of different ways that I can answer this, like 4, maybe 5 ways, but let's briefly touch on each one. Let's say you're a non-believer and you're like, well, how does the soul interact with the body? And I say this, I don't know. Therefore what?
Yeah.
My car, so by the way, I drive a Kia Soul because usually when I talk on philosophy of mind, I use it to make a joke.
Wow.
I bought the car just to make the joke. It's a very rich
Wow.
punchline, if you will. Because, I tell people I don't have a Soul, and I'm like, well, actually I do. I changed my mind a few years ago. I bought a Kia Soul. Yeah, I was soul searching when I was looking for the car. Anyways,
That
I have
is
to
hilarious.
milk it for every penny because it's why I bought the car. Going back to okay. Let's say I say, I don't know. So my car right now is actually in the shop. My soul, unfortunately, pray for it. It is going through some issues. I don't know how much longer it lasts. I got it in 2018. Nevertheless, if I were to go to the mechanic right now, let's say, hey, your car's ready to be picked up. If he says, wait, before I give you the keys, how does your engine work? How do the interactions within the motor, how does that take place and how does it function? And if I said, I don't know, and he's like, boom, got you, your car doesn't exist. No,
Wow.
I don't know how my car works. I'm not a mechanic, but I know it exists. So note, me being ignorant of how something works doesn't disprove its existence, doesn't affect its existence. It's just an irrelevant question if we're talking about the existence of the soul. So that's one way I could just say, I don't know. But that doesn't disprove it, because in other words, the arguments I'm giving are ontological arguments in the sense of like within reality, metaphysically speaking, we know that a soul must exist to ground consciousness and to ground identity through change and personhood, things of that nature. So these are arguments that are ontological in nature. The question is epistemic in nature. Do you know how this interacts with this? But note, you're not going to be able to give me a question epistemically. Do you know how this works? And I say no, because that wouldn't affect the arguments that I've presented ontologically. These are 2 separate categories. This question doesn't affect whether or not any of the arguments or whether or not they're true or whether or not the soul exists. A second way I can answer is just say, well, it's just is to say, well, first of all, it seems like you're assuming that there's an intermediate mechanism between the 2. What do I mean by that? If I were to say that A interacts with B, and you said, well, how does A interact with B? I could say, well, via some C. There you go. Give you an answer. And you're like, well, wait a minute. Hold on. Well, how does A interact with C to interact with B? By some mechanism D. And what eventually happens is if we keep doing this, we can go to an infinite regress, which means the action will never happen. But the most simplest position here is to say, well, it's just an immediate primitive action. It's just a direct A to B. There is no intervening mechanism. So again, let's go back to the car. If you ask me how this works, you're like, I don't know. Well, how does a car, when you plug into the engine, how does it make this turn? I don't know, but I do know that all you need to do is get the key in here and turn, and it's just direct and immediate. There's no further explanation than that. And to ask or beg the question, to ask us to beg the question that there's a further explanation, it could just be a direct A to B.
Hmm.
Second, so that's two. I'll give you two more really quick. Some people argue that the soul cannot interact with the body because that would break the one of the laws of thermodynamics, that energy cannot be created or destroyed. Well, first, that begs the question and assumes that this is a closed system. That law is more of a rule of thumb that applies to closed systems. But if God exists, the universe isn't necessarily a closed system. And if I have a soul, then I'm at a closed system. So, first of all, it begs a question that this is a closed system. It assumes a type of naturalism. Second, um, if energy were created and this is an open system, then one could say, okay, well, but why can't we detect it? And love, I got this illustration from Moreland. I got all this from Moreland. Um, he says, imagine if there was just one switch in the Hoover Dam, that if you flipped it, it would release all the water in the Hoover Dam. He says, now compare the amount of energy it takes to flip the switch and the amount of energy that's released from flipping the switch. Compare those two. And I mean, the energy that it takes to flip the switch is essentially drowned out by all of the water coming to the dam, no pun intended. Uh, so it could be the case that, yeah, maybe the soul does create some type of energy, but the amount of energy that comes from that release of energy, creation of energy, is just essentially drowned out by whatever I'm doing, right? That takes so much more energy to lift my hand, or so to speak. So it could be that maybe we just can't detect it, or maybe at least at this point it's impossible to detect the amount of energy that the soul creates in order to do the rest of the stuff. Because all it needs to do is trigger something, and then the body can, you know, does what it needs to do with the muscles, the fibers, all that stuff. And then the fourth type of answer you can give, which I think is really fascinating, it comes from quantum mechanics. And there is something in quantum mechanics known as quantum entanglement. And essentially, it's the notion that you can have two particles that are like so far apart that we know there is not an exchange of energy going on. But what's interesting is that if you observe one or do something to one, it automatically simultaneously affects the other one.
Hmm.
But again, the distance is so far that we know there's not an exchange of energy. We don't know how that works. It's called like spooky physics or something like that. But there's something going on at the quantum level that these two particles are entangled. And I've heard it proposed that the soul and body interaction could be something like that. It could be that if you do something on one end, there's this quantum entanglement that somehow results in an action happening on the other end, and yet no energy is created, no energy is exchanged. So I've given you 4 or 5 answers there. I mean, I tell them, hey, pick which one you want, and then we can get back to whether or not the soul exists.
That is awesome. Yeah, I mean, it really, those are fantastic answers, but I love how you started it. Just because you don't know how it works exactly doesn't mean you don't know that it exists. I think that's a huge distinction. But those answers are fantastic. Eric, let me see, we are about 11 minutes over. I want to thank you again for jumping on. Maybe share with our listeners. I know you did this in our last conversation as well, but where can we find your work, your website? What are you working on next? I think some of our listeners would be excited to hear what you've been doing, and yeah, share with our listeners all that good stuff.
Yeah, a good question. And thank you. So I know there sometime this year I contributed a chapter to a book on AI. I think it's called Stewarding AI. Don't quote me on that. But initially they didn't have a chapter in philosophy of mind, and a friend of mine who's writing a chapter for that book basically brought me up and then asked me if I'd be able and willing to do it. So I wrote a chapter on philosophy of mind and AI, how we should think and talk about AI. And it kind of goes into, in fact, I use the same story about when I asked the church what part of your body thinks, because it's really a trick question. No part of your body thinks, but we don't even know how to think about our thinking, that the trick question goes over our head.
Right.
I'm not sure when that's coming out. On top of that, I'm working through creating a workbook for my book, The Lazy Approach. But in this transition that I mentioned last time, started a nonprofit ministry in January. We're donor funded, raising support to continue doing full time ministry. The Lord has done amazing stuff there. And so my hands have been a little bit full with that, getting it going and making sure everything's running operationally smooth, learning the ins and outs of running a nonprofit. But I'd like to finish that workbook. And I've already been implementing it, where I go to churches and we'll do 3 days of apologetics and evangelism training. And I'll implement the exercises from my workbook. So it's not necessarily me just teaching and talking for 10 hours. The last place I went to was a 10-hour training, Friday, Saturday, Sunday altogether. But it's actually like hands-on exercising, practicing, learning these tools. Um, Aside from that, I would like to just kind of get do more content, do more things like this, study more in specifically deity of Christ, because I'd like to begin engaging a lot more publicly with Muslims, Hebrew Israelites, Jehovah Witnesses, people who deny the deity of Christ, because that seems to be growing for whatever reason. And I think it's interesting that all the cults, all the false religions, will all deny the deity of Christ. And so there's definitely something to that. Aside from that, yeah, would love everyone's prayers. We just moved into our new home, so there are some boxes in this room that you can't see. So yeah, just keep us in your prayers for time management, that the Lord would lead us in the right places, open the right doors, close the wrong doors, and create ones where there are none. And our website is now up. I don't think it was up last time we talked, but it's ehmapologetics.org. You can find some resources there, some other things I've done. I was in a documentary film called Universe Designed. That was really cool. It's streaming on Amazon, Hulu, and a few other places. You can type in Universe Designed. You have other apologists in there like Hugh Ross, Frank Turek, Greg Kokel, Jay Warner Wallace is in there, Alyssa Childers, a bunch of other awesome heavy hitters in apologetics.
Yes, definitely. I try and celebrate and spread that documentary as far as I can, because it is just so well done. We had Hugh Ross on the channel not long ago to give us all the
Awesome.
evidence for old Earth, and he is just so wise. So much insight as an astrophysicist. Crazy
Yeah.
field to begin with. But
Yeah, he is.
listeners, yeah, please pray for Eric and his family. Check out his website. I'll put it in the show notes, and keep him in prayer. We all know moving in is not always the most fun thing to do, and it's very hectic, but it's a new start. So we'll be praying for you, Eric. And I just really appreciate you for jumping on. Thanks for joining, sharing your wisdom here. I deeply appreciate it.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me.
All righty. Well, to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. God bless.